Right, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear me okay. My name's Alice Bradbury. I'm co-director of the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Pedagogy at the IOE, and I am really pleased to see so many participants here today for our joint seminar with the Tomas Coram Research Unit, also at the Institute of Education. We're really pleased to have so many attendees. We had lots of people signed up and hope it's going to be a really fantastic seminar this afternoon. We're really interested within the Helen Hamlyn Centre in the idea of children's agency, and so we're really pleased to be working with the Tomas Coram Research Unit colleagues on this event today. It's a notion that is really relevant to both early childhood and to primary education, and it's an idea common to both sectors. And today the idea is that we explore how both sectors might benefit from a real dialogue based on a strong and equal relationship. It's a really emerging area for us within the Helen Hamlyn Centre in our research and the focus of our conference in June. So we're really pleased that we can begin the conversation today. We'll be posting links for that conference and for other Tomas Coram Research Unit events in the chat later on. So look out for those if you're interested in exploring these ideas further. So a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to be taking questions via the Q&A function. So please do get involved with the conversation. The speakers, our two main speakers, Alison and then Yana and Dom, are both going to have about 15 minutes each to speak, and then we'll have 5 minutes for Q&A. So please do send questions in the chat and then I will pose them to our speakers. And then at the end, we've got a panel discussion addressing the questions which have come up throughout with all of our speakers. And so please do kind of keep those questions coming through. Make my job easy as a chair by giving me lots of questions to ask all our speakers. If you would like to share the event today on social media, you'll have seen the hashtag transforminged21 on the beginning slide. So do use that to spread the word, please. That would be great. And now to begin, I'm going to hand over to Peter Moss, our colleague from the Tomas Coram Research Unit, and Emeritus Professor of Early Childhood. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. I hope you can all see me. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Pedagogy. I'd like to introduce a speaker, a book, and a proposal. The speaker coming next is Alison Clark, and I've had the great pleasure and privilege of working with Alison for many years, since she first came to the Tomas Coram Research Unit in the late 1990s, where she developed her innovative mosaic approach, this innovative way of listening to young children from as young as babies up to 5 or 6 years old. And this has opened up the possibility of understanding the experiences and perspectives of young children with new opportunities for their participation and their agency. The mosaic approach is now internationally recognized and used, most recently in China, where it is being employed to get young children's perspectives on the transition from kindergarten to primary school. More recently, Alison has been working on another subject, slow knowledge and slow pedagogy, and she'll talk about this work in her presentation. But you can also find out more of the mosaic approach and slow pedagogy in her chapter in this book, Transforming Early Childhood in England Towards Education. The book was published last August and contains contributions from 18 academics at or associated with UCL's Institute of Education. It takes a broad and a critical look at early childhood education and care in England today, and also examines some of the other problems faced by many families with young children: poverty, homelessness, and inadequate parenting leave. As the title suggests, the book calls for transformative change of a deeply flawed system. Transformative change covering the types of provision we offer, the early years workforce, pedagogy and accountability. transformative change based on children's rights and fundamental values of democracy, solidarity, and cooperation, and transformative change leading to a public system of early childhood education for all. If you want to read Alison's chapter or any of the other contributors, you can easily do so, as the book, and usually, can be accessed free online, and details will be given at the end of Alison's presentation. Finally, a proposal. Claire Cameron and I, as co-editors of Transforming Early Childhood in England, have been discussing what to do next to take forward the transformation agenda for early childhood. The need for radical change has been evident for years. The COVID pandemic has only strengthened that case. In a recent article in Nursery World, we propose that, and I'm quoting, "What we need now is a thorough and comprehensive root and branch review of early childhood policies, provision, and pedagogy to create, at long last, early childhood policies, provision, and pedagogy that we can all be proud of." You'll find the link to our article again at the end of Alison's presentation, and we very much welcome your comments on this proposal for a review. So now I'd like to hand you over to Alison to talk about her transformatory work on early childhood pedagogy.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay. And thank you for this opportunity to talk to you this afternoon. So my talk is called Running to Catch Up, Rethinking the Relationship Between Time and Voice in Young Children's Learning. I think there are very few opportunities in education for children to look back. The emphasis is almost always on moving forward, reaching the next milestone. It takes time to look back, but time is in short supply. The pandemic has added to this sense of the need for children to continually keep up, to run to catch up, although there has been a counter-argument within the sector to press for a summer of play. When time is seen to be in short supply, it is easier to deliver a pre-packaged curriculum rather than to enable children to learn through doing. Pre-packaged learning is a passive style of learning. My youngest child, who is now himself a teacher, often said to me as a 2-year-old, "I do it myself." But enabling children to do it themselves takes time. This resonates with John Dewey's concept of plasticity, in which he says, in learning an action, instead of having it given ready-made, one of necessity learns to vary its factors, to make varied combinations of them according to change of circumstances. And Harriet Cafaro explains, plasticity is the power to retain from one experience that which will be of use in coping with the difficulties and newness of later situations. So the role of time in such encounters is often understated, but of great importance, especially if learning is taken place within a context of the need to catch up. So time and early childhood and play are interconnected, and the relationship between these three elements are at the centre of my current research study, funded by the Froebel Trust, called Slow Knowledge and the Unhurried Child. So the study makes the case for the need to be slow in early childhood education and care. At a time of acceleration of childhood, the research seeks alternative ways of working with young children that pay attention to time, pace, rhythm, and play. Valuing slow knowledge and slow pedagogies is an underdeveloped explicit discourse in early childhood education, but I think implicitly informs many alternative narratives to what Smedley and Hoskins have called the increasing statutory pressure towards performativity and regulation. So my study focuses on key informant interviews with early childhood researchers, practitioners and advisors in England, Scotland, Wales, Norway, Japan, Denmark, Portugal, Israel, USA, Canada, and Australia. I first heard the phrase, the hurried child, in conversation with a Japanese colleague, Mary Mori. The book, The Hurried Child, Growing Up Too Fast, Too Soon, was the title of a publication written by the American psychologist David Elkind, first published in 1981, making the case for the pressure on children from parents, school, and the media. So debates about hurriedness and childhood are not new. So the slow movement has been one response to accelerated living, beginning with the slow food movement, set up in opposition, amongst other things, to fast food. Honorary's popular book In Praise of Slow documented the spread of ideas about alternatives to fast-paced living across different areas of everyday life, including food and education. Honorary describes the catalyst for his book as being a reflection on his time-pressed parenting and the lure of what he called the 1-minute bedtime story. Here, a practice of relating to children is quantified and dictated by the clock. It is an example among many of acceleration. So what happens if early childhood education is explored through a temporal lens? How might slow pedagogies and slow knowledge be defined, and where are the slow practices? I'd like to share briefly some of the interview participants' explorations of these definitions, and this is very much work in progress. So exploring definitions of slow pedagogies, and I'm deliberately saying slow pedagogies plural, because this isn't about just finding one slow. My conversation with Kate Cowan, play researcher and teacher, explained she saw slow pedagogies as, I think it's seeing learning as something that you do with children rather than to children, and something that has time for wonder and uncertainty. So we see here in this definition the importance of collaboration, of learning with children rather than just delivering learning, of room for wonder and also for uncertainty. So the freedom from not needing to know all the answers as educators, that can be quite threatening. And then my second definition is from Mandy Bateman, teacher educator in early childhood, working at the time in Wales and now heading up a research centre in New Zealand. Mandy commented, I think slow pedagogies are interactions between a teacher and child or children where talk and gesture explore and ponder a concept of interest in great detail. It is less about linear time. It doesn't have to be a sustained interaction, but more about full engagement in the flow of deep time. So I think the use of this vocabulary is really important here. The full engagement, the flow, linking to Chinksang Mahani's work, and this idea of deep time. Many participants raise this connection between slow and deep learning. And then my third definition here is from Carrie Carlson, an early childhood teacher educator in Norway and artist. And she says, I think it has to be a shared attitude by adults and children, the way of cooperating or being together with children, and also the environment. But if I should define slow pedagogies, this points to what Carlina Rinaldi from Reggio Emilia Schools says about listening. So here we have this relationship with children and adults and the environment as being very much part of these slow engagement, but also the link between slow and listening. And I explore these connections in the chapter that Peter mentioned in Transforming Early Childhood in England. But what about slow knowledge? In order to think through these ideas, I ran a virtual reading group last year, and we began by discussing an article by the environmentalist David Orr on slow knowledge. And I think this is an example within education to keep on looking from beyond the boundaries of education for ideas, as well as looking within. So David Orr says about slow knowledge, and here are some of the characteristics he pulls out. Fast knowledge deals with discrete things, whereas slow knowledge deals with context, patterns, and connections. So therefore, I understand that to mean that slow knowledge, it won't be uniform. It's not one size fits all. Fast knowledge, he says, is mostly linear, whereas slow knowledge is complex and ecological. So slow knowledge won't necessarily follow in a straight line and can be messy and difficult to measure. And I think it's the difficult to measure that can be such a challenge to our measurement culture. Fast knowledge is characterized by power and instability. Slow knowledge is known by its elegance, complexity, and resilience. Interestingly, how rare that word elegance is within education, I think. And increasingly, young children will need to have the opportunity to gain knowledge that is resilient, that will last in uncertain futures. And then fast knowledge is often abstract and theoretical, engaging only a portion of the mind. Slow knowledge engages all of the senses and the full range of our mental powers. But of course, this multi-sensory understanding of learning, giving children the opportunity to use all of their senses, takes time. And then lastly, fast knowledge is always new. Slow knowledge often is very old. I think this too is a challenge for our contemporary times. I think often we're only looking at innovation. And often in education, I think there are ideas to be reclaimed and revisited. And I find that particularly pertinent within early childhood. So, what about slow practices? So what might slow practices look like? I think there is a strong connection between slow practices and the opportunities for children to demonstrate their agency. So Julia Oliveira Formosino was another participant, an early childhood researcher and teacher educator from Portugal. And Julia comments, slow practices are connected to participatory pedagogies that really want children to be included and to have a voice. And it takes time to give voice. It takes time to document voice. And she also comments in terms of project work. Project work is for me another way to develop a pedagogy of slowness that really respects children's voices and not only curriculum voices. So this respecting of children's voices and not only curriculum voices. I think slow practices can contain what could be seen as stretched time. And I think having words for talking about what we're looking at here is really important, because the measurement culture comes ready-made with a whole set of vocabulary that we're very familiar with. I think we need to maybe make more explicit this relationship with time. So Cafaro says, stretch time. Well, with such awareness and understanding, it becomes important to think about a schedule that makes it possible for children to work without many interruptions and transitions from one activity to another. Non-fragmented stretches of time not only give children the opportunity for more in-depth involvement and experimentation, but allow room for situations to evolve, to become meaningful in a way that they may not be at first glance. Within this stretched time, greater possibility exists for making choices and for experiencing the consequences of one's doing. Such an approach requires that time be viewed as perspective, as rhythm, as opportunity, and that present moment be fully valued. So within stretched time, and these, what she calls non-fragmented, so this ability to maybe spill over into different parts of the day. In this non-fragmented time, there are greater opportunities for children to make choices and to experience what happens next. Last week, I ran a focus group with early childhood practitioners to discuss the emerging findings from my study. We stretched geographically from the Highlands to central London. The group included a forest school practitioner, an art educator, an early childhood pedagogue, and early childhood practitioners working across the age range. We discussed slow practices. And I wanted to just mention one example from one of the participants, Annette Ledger, one of the focus group participants working in a nursery and studying at University of Greenwich. And Annette gave this example of a slow practice that she'd been involved in. She said, I had a situation at nursery where 3 boys were sitting in front of our metal gate. They had thrown a squishy ball over the gate and couldn't get it back. And I heard them talking about getting the ball back. Anyway, my colleague called out, it's snack time. And I could see on the boys were distraught about the ball being on the other side of the gate. So I said, hang on a minute. And we sat there trying to work out ways of getting the ball back. The boys got a stick and they were trying to put the stick as near as they could to the ball, but the stick was not long enough. So they are trying to get different objects to pull the ball nearer to the gate. We had the most incredible time just getting this squishy ball back to the point at which they could put their little hands through and squash it down enough to pull it under the gate. And it was just priceless. Now, had we just said, oh, leave it until later, we've got to go inside because it's snack time, we would have not had that wonderful learning experience. It was obvious how satisfying it was for them and how much they benefited from that extra time spent doing something that meant so much to them. One of the boys in this small group was usually a very quiet boy, but on this occasion, his interaction with the other children was incredible. I believe it's because it was something he was interested in, and he felt like he was generally part of the group. He just seemed so happy. So thinking about the value of slow practices and the opportunities for children's agency has implications for the way we work with timetables, for the way we work with the environment and materials, and with assessment. So there are many other examples of slow practices with young children and adults, demonstrating where different relationships with time already exist, and raises some of these following questions. How to be slow outdoors, how to be slow with materials, how to be slow with a book, how to be slow with children's photographs, how to be slow with pedagogical documentation, how to be slow with video reflection, how to be slow with digital technology, and how to be slow with routines through the day. There are challenges here, and I'm not suggesting that this is an easy path to follow in the current climate. I think it requires the ability to navigate the paradoxes between the nature of play and the nature of school, as Mary Kravetsky and her colleagues at Project Zero at Harvard University have described. But despite these challenges, I would argue that slow has become urgent. Thank you. Here are the details of the book for the free download and for the Nursery World article.
Thank you very much, Alison, for that really very interesting presentation. We're going to have just 5 minutes of questions now, and I'm going to start off with one from the chat. Please do write in some questions, everyone else. If you have things to ask Alison, that would be fantastic. But we're going to start off with a question here from Susan Durston, who asks about your project. What was the rationale for the focus countries being all in advanced economies? And do you have any thoughts about middle and low income countries?
Well, I think in any research study of this exploratory nature, it's a beginning. And I realise that there are many, many other perspectives to open up here about Indigenous communities and slow practices, for example, and in the majority world. So it is only a beginning, and it's within the constraints of the study, but I think there are many, many different examples to add here.
Thank you. I wanted to just follow up with that with a question of my own, which was, across your countries, there's such a variety of different early childhood systems. You know, we have a very particular system, very data driven and so on. But do you think that the same kind of problem of the hurried child is as present in some of those other systems as it is in our system in England, where we're so affected by regulation and performativity and so on?
Well, as I was explaining, one of the ideas behind the study first came about with discussions with a Japanese colleague, and so it very, very much was part of her struggles there, was within a very hurried system. Interestingly, talking to Danish colleagues, a very different, sort of more of an acknowledgement of a sort of social pedagogy within their everyday practice in early childhood. And so this idea of the hurried child was much less familiar, and they thought, well, actually we're doing all this, yeah, what's this about?
Right, okay, thank you. And so if you were an early childhood practitioner or a teacher and you're listening to this and you sort of thought, I would really like to start bringing some of this into my classroom or my setting, what where would be the best place to begin? Well, how would you advise people to sort of begin finding the time or the space?
I think firstly, it might not necessarily be a question of beginning, but of being able to have more professional confidence in acknowledging the good things that are happening, and where children are having this more slower pace and are able to play and explore and bring their own ideas. Because I think sometimes it's a question of educators having the confidence to say, actually, no, this is really important. And I think we're seeing that in the summer of play discussions and in the sort of fight back against a strict recovery curriculum. So actually, no, we need children to give them time to play, to talk, to socialize. So I guess rather than beginning, I would say being proud and acknowledging. In one of the examples given me by a participant was looking at lunchtimes, and this was from Australia, and saying that she started working with her teams at looking at the pace at lunchtime, looking at the control that children had or didn't have, and started that as a very practical focus, and then moved out to think about other parts of the day.
Oh, that's really, really interesting. I know my daughter in reception always says lunchtime is very, very rushed. And you think, well, there's a lot of potential there lost for conversations and discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question here from Rachel Parkin. How do you see families and practitioners working together using a slow pedagogy approach?
Well, I think this points again to communication and to explaining why what might be the value in the slower approaches, because I think there can be a big tension with parents who are wanting children to move quickly on to the next stage, to be shown evidence of where they've got to. So I think this needs to be carefully explained and shared, so that it's not done in opposition to parents.
And similarly, do you think senior leaders perhaps might have similar oppositional kind of need to catch up and need to keep moving more quickly?
Well, possibly, and I think and each of us in our different educational environments were so aware of the external pressures. I mean, what I found from my participants, that they're also articulating an internal pressure of feeling that they need to perform, and that actually of kind of learning where those pressures are coming from, and actually whether they are real or not. Do they actually have more freedom?
Is there potential for families, do you think, to be advocates for this kind of slow pedagogy? Do you think, if they become more aware of it? Or
yes, I think so. Yes, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, and I've got another question here from Marie, who asks, will you be presenting your research to the government in the hope they may incorporate into policy? I suppose I'd also add to that, how would you like to see it incorporated into policy? What would change?
Change. Well, I think we see in early childhood a constant reinventing the wheel and a sort of continuing revisiting the same policy debates, and I'd like to see rather than always moving on to the new, but a kind of policies that take more account of the strong early childhood traditions that we have.
Okay. Right, lots more questions coming in, one of which we might leave to later. I think we've probably got time for just one or two more before the next talk. Question from Lucy Kaufman says, have you encountered a link between the level of agency children are afforded and the development of learning dispositions or positive learner identities?
That's not something that has come out so far, but I think that's an interesting development. That sounds like a PhD discovery for me, I think, for someone.
Yes, in fact, we have someone within the Helen Hamlyn Centre doing research on children's agency, answering the question very much like that. So,
yes, yeah.
But not yet. Okay, and another one from Dominic Gunn, who says, have you made further connections yet regarding engaging all the senses and an apparent increase recently in sensory needs in schools?
I haven't, but I think that when I was talking about when we're looking at the contrast between fast and slow knowledge and how, slow knowledge involving all the senses, but that does need that needs more time to do so. It's much easier if we're just using, say written communication or verbal communication. So I think there are big possibilities there.
Yeah, good question. And then finally, last one from Angela Scollin. The transition of slow pedagogies between early years and Key Stage 1 is interesting to consider. How understanding is translated and reacted to between both. So it's not exactly a question, but a comment. I think that's an interesting point, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that transition between the two, I think it's a very important area to think about whether these concepts of slow are actually helpful. And that's actually coming out in this Chinese research that's just starting.
And I think it's particularly interesting in this context where there's concern, particularly about those pupils who've made that early years to Key Stage 1 transition, isn't it, during the pandemic, who've missed out on so much reception and so on. It's particularly relevant to them to perhaps think about how we might incorporate slow pedagogies.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Alison. We will come back to you later for the panel, but for the meantime, thank you very much. We are now going to hand over to Dominic Wyse, Director of the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Pedagogy, and Yana Manyukhina, who's a research fellow within the centre, who are going to speak about their current research on children's agency and the national curriculum. Over to you, Dom.
Okay, so first of all, thanks very much to Alison. So wonderful to be provoked into thinking in new ways. Just a quick reflection from me. Dewey nearly always makes me think again and again in different ways. And for me, your mention of Dewey reminded me of his emphasis on the interaction between the educator and the learner, which we see as a very important definitional aspect of pedagogy, and that balance between educator and learner. And in fact, Dewey goes so far as to conceive of the whole of education as linked to that kind of balance. In a rather different way of thinking, Dewey, of course, placed human language at the very heart of a lot of the way he thought. And I discovered his idea in terms of written language, the idea of the consummatory versus the instrumental. I was working on my book, How Writing Works, and the consummatory is a sophisticated endpoint of human endeavor, for example, represented in major artworks that combine written language with music, perhaps with visual arts, with dance. Whereas the instrumental is just as important, but very different, and it gets the business of life done. So thank you for the mention of Dewey. Also the mention of knowledge, which brings us closer to what Yana and I have been working on in relation to pedagogy and in relation to agency. So I just want to share very briefly one starting point for Yana and I and for the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Pedagogy. about 3 years ago, we were contacted by the Curriculum Authority in Ireland, who asked us to do some research, a small research project in relation to how knowledge might be defined in a new national curriculum for primary education in Ireland. And the work we did was, apart from the usual review of literature, and Yana did the work on a content analysis of 4 different countries' national curriculum texts. These were chosen we were required to choose them in particular ways. But what struck us, to cut a longish story short, what struck us was in these national curriculum texts and what we knew about their education systems, they were all high performing in relation to international comparative tests. Now, of course, there's a lively debate, very lively debate about the merits of those. But what was striking to us was the differences in the way they conceived overall children's agency in relation to knowledge, in relation to skills, in relation to content, and so on. All successful. And I suppose the 2 polar opposites were where Hong Kong, for example, declared that through its text, that agency was central, that children having control over their education was central. And at the other end, you may not be surprised to hear, was England, with its heavy knowledge-based national curriculum. Anyway, we did that work, and inevitably it provoked us to think more about what Yana and I brought that was complementary and different to that project. Yana has been interested in agency since her PhD, and I realized I had been in different ways, but I have had a long interest in curriculum, national curriculum policy, the levers, and so on, and the design features. And all of that led us to put in a proposal to the Leverhulme Trust for a project on children's agency and the national curriculum. Unusually, we proposed ethnography and a longitudinal design, and you probably know that's not easy, never easy to get funding, but ethnography is not an easy design to get funded. So we were delighted basically to get a 40-month project. And we're at the beginning of it, although as you've heard, it's developing a key theme of the Helen Hamlyn Centre, which is children's agency. One thing we're doing, in fact, we heard 2 days ago, we're delighted that Routledge have agreed to publish a book coming out of the project, although we won't deliver that manuscript until December 2024. So, that's quite deliberate, because we genuinely want people to help us refine the ideas as we go, and we've got time to do it. We will be collecting data, and so this is our first chance really to say to you, please help us think about this and send us your papers and your ideas, and we will do our very best to build these into the way we think about this whole project. So I'm going to hand over to Yana now, who's going to go into some more of the detail around where we've got so far.
Thank you, Dom, and hello everyone. It's really good to see such a great number of people joining us. I will, in my part of the talk, I will focus mostly on the theoretical part of what agency means, because as we started doing the project and as we started thinking about agency more deeply, we realized that the concept is not as easily defined as it might appear. So in the literature, the way agency is commonly defined is the capacity to act. But we find that this definition is not subtle enough in that it doesn't capture the distinct elements that are essential to agency. In my talk, I will use the phrase children's agency, because of course that's what the project focus is on, and that's what our key interest is. But I think that the theoretical thinking that we have done on agency applies to agency in general. It's just that in the talk, for the sake of the project, I will use children's agency throughout. So I want to share our thinking on the concept of agency, and it would be most useful to hear your thoughts on this, because this is very much work in progress for us too, as we're just starting to conduct the project. So what does capacity to act consist of or require? There are two elements. There is a subjective element to it, which is a sense of agency, which refers to children's belief in their ability to act independently and to exercise choice in learning. And there is an objective element, which is the structural opportunities that children have or don't have in the classroom, in the school, in relation to their learning. So it's only when both of these elements are in place, that's when children have a sense of agency and opportunities to act on it, that actual exercise of agency can occur. Having a sense of agency alone is not enough for children to exercise their agency in the classroom if they're not provided with real opportunities to do so. And equally, even where opportunities are present, they can't be realized unless children recognize them and feel capable of acting upon them. And from a theoretical point of view, opportunities that are provided to children and recognized by them, we call affordances. And it's affordances, not just opportunities, that we think need to be present in the classroom to make the exercise of agency possible for children. These two elements, the individual and the structural, play a key role in making agency possible. And when we think about the definition of agency, we want this definition to reflect this. In the literature, we have come across a definition that almost meets this criterion. In her work on agency and language, the anthropologist Laura Ahern defines agency as socio-culturally mediated capacity to act. And we like this definition because the socio-culturally mediated bit does the job of acknowledging the role of structure in determining children's capacity to exercise agency. Yet we think that this definition is not quite accurate still, and it's for the following reason. When we talk about structure in relation to agency, we understand that structure can either enable or constrain children's ability to exercise agency. And this is what we mean when we say that structure mediates agency. But the enabling or constraining effects of structure can only manifest themselves in relation to specific intentions and actions of agents. Because, and here I will quote one of the prominent contemporary critical realists, Margaret Archer, constraints requires something to constrain and enablements something to enable. What this means is that structure remains neutral unless and until agents can contemplate, conceive of, or embark on a certain action. Then agency, we think, is best defined not as socio-culturally mediated capacity to act, but as socio-culturally situated capacity to act. The latter definition, unlike the former, acknowledges not only that agency is embedded within structure, but also that the mediating effect of structure is not a priori present, but becomes activated only in the presence of an attempt to act or an intention to do so. And the intention bit is also important because structural constraints and enablements may influence agency through mere anticipation. If an agent or a child perceives her context as being conducive to the action she wants to take, then she will be more likely to pursue it, while an expectation of failure is likely to serve as a discouragement. It's this definition of agency that we apply in our investigation of the potential effects of the national curriculum on children's agency. We think that the school curriculum represents one of the main elements of the structure in which children's learning takes place. How it's designed and delivered affects both children's sense of agency and their opportunities to exercise agency in their learning. How exactly and to what extent this happens is what we are going to explore through case studies of 18 primary age children in 3 different schools across England. So this is where we have arrived in our thinking about agency theoretically. And the next bit that we're really looking forward to is to test that definition in practice, to see to what extent individual element works in tandem or against the structural element in bringing agency about in the classroom. And we, like I said, we focus on children's agency, but I think the same thinking and the same design could apply to teachers' agency. which of course is something that needs to be considered, and we are aware of it when talking about children's agency in the classroom. I think I should stop here, and we have a quick poll for the audience to gauge your thinking on agency.
Yana, I think the both sets of answers are really interesting. The very clear sense from people here today that the current system of schooling, by which I'm assuming everyone is referring to England but may not be, it is inhibiting children's agency. And then the second answer is, I think, kind of reflects some of our early thinking, doesn't it? And the reactions. In fact, I think it was Mark Priestley's presentation for the department, the DLL department seminar, that prompted us to think about, can there be too much agency in the children's agency? And I think the answers here are much less certain, aren't they? That although no is the majority view, significant number of not sure, you know. And I think that's a really very interesting question indeed.
And the 20% is not an insignificant number of people who think there can be too much agency.
Exactly.
Really interested to hear from those.
Yeah. And certainly the good news is, more good news is, there's plenty of room, according to participants, for children's agency. So that's certainly what we're interested in, isn't it? The parameters, the extent to which agency is exercised or not, and what might be the reasons. And in fact, we will ask what the reasons are of the teachers and the children.
Okay, thank you very much, Dom and Yana. And thank you everyone for answering the poll. We're going to now turn to some questions. So if our attendees, please do keep writing questions in the Q&A. We're going to talk to Dom and Yana first, and then we will move to the panel with everyone. So we've got a few questions. First of all, this is quite a long one, so bear with me. Charlotte says she's interested in the distinction between the subjective feeling of agency and objective mechanisms for agency. She says, I suppose ideally we want to nurture people to be active in their learning, and then as older learners to continue to be active in their own learning. I see that mechanisms for agency are important, but also might having a focus on that mean that learners lose their feelings of agency when those mechanisms aren't there? Dom or Yana?
I want to, Dom, are you okay with me clarifying?
Yeah, go for it.
I want to clarify what is meant by mechanism, because this is not the term or word that I used in my in sharing our thinking on agency. So I wonder what is meant by mechanism before I can respond to this. What I was referring to is structure. So the two elements was the subjective sense of agency that children develop within them, that they can then bring onto their learning, and the objective element, what the context in which the learning takes place, and that includes different elements, the curriculum being one of the major ones that affects whether children feel that they can act independently and make choice in the classroom, but also whether they have the opportunities to do so. So yeah. By mechanism, the mechanism would be a very different term that I would.
I mean, I wonder if, and Charlotte might want to add a clarification, but I wonder if the curriculum itself is being regarded as a big mechanism, and that you know, one can focus on the mechanism, but is that sufficient? We are of course not only focusing on curriculum as a potential mechanism.
Okay, well, Charlotte, do feel free to clarify further if that hasn't been, your question hasn't been answered. Let's move to another one for now. So Nikki asks, do you feel inquiry-based learning lends itself to children's agency?
Shall I go first on this time, Yana?
Please.
Well, I think one of the things that we've been discussing, Yana and I, but also with Becky, one of our PhD students, is, you know, agency, as Yana has articulated very clearly, is a theoretical idea, can be a complex theoretical idea, but of course we always have to concern ourselves with what does this actually mean in practice. That's one of the missions of the centre. And I think inquiry learning should have choice. So learners in inquiry learning are supposed to follow their hunches and their interests. And I'm thinking, classically, this might be in science investigation, mightn't it? Possibly mathematical investigation and so on. So it strikes me that choice is surely one important element of agency, in which case I'd say inquiry-based learning, problem solving to some degree, may well have some characteristics of agency.
Okay, thank you. We also have another question here from our colleague Eleanor Hargreaves, who says, have you found that there are problems with using the word agency? Do some people misconceive it to mean doing whatever you like rather than feeling the power to take initiatives?
Go on, Yana.
We haven't yet engaged in field work for the project, so we can't really report any views of the teachers in the school that we're going to work with. In our conversations around the agency that have been happening so far, I don't remember anyone using agency in this sense, although the conversation has been around whether there can be too much agency. I think that's a related worry. And in relation to children's agency in the classroom, like you see in the poll, opinions are split. And this is one of the focus, one of our foci going into schools and looking at what agency looks like in practice and what the implications might be. Dom, do you want to add anything?
No, that sounds good.
Okay, thank you, Dom and Yana. I think we'll open it up now to the wider panel, and so please do continue to write questions for all of our participants. So we'll be welcoming back Peter and Alison, and also Claire Cameron, also from the Tomas Coram Research Unit, is joining us too for the panel. We've got a number of questions about all of the topics that you've discussed. One of which is a kind of theme through a few of them, which is about how do you think lockdown has affected things like slow pedagogies in the family? Also, how do you think more widely, maybe the whole experience of the pandemic has affected children's levels of agency? So I shall just let you volunteer to jump in on that quite broad one. Alison.
Yeah, okay, so I'll start. I think that the pandemic, the experience has been so different for so many different families. So I think it's difficult to generalize, and we shouldn't generalize, but I think it has brought time and our relationship with time center stage, whether it's really slowed things up and had too much time almost, or actually made it frenetic because they're trying to juggle everything at the same time. And I guess children are caught in the middle, have been caught in the middle of that, and will have very different experiences. But sort of talking anecdotally with friends with young children, some have said that it has given them greater opportunities to be more relaxed and more and to just enjoying playing at home with children. So, you know, perhaps there might be more from some quarters, more understanding of a less pressured way forward.
Yeah, I just support that from a study that I've been doing in Tower Hamlets with families with children under 5, looking at the impact of the pandemic. And we asked participants, there's about 900 participants, we asked them about any aspects of lockdown that had been enjoyable. And one of I think the most common, or the second most common answer was that there was more time as a family. And as a lot of the qualitative material we've been looking at is talking about appreciating time together, noticing things about the children they hadn't noticed before, and particularly for people who'd had babies during the pandemic, opportunities to have dads at home. Taking the time away from commuting seemed to be the biggest benefit. Having said all that, Alison's completely right. It's very different for people in different income brackets and different amount of space in their houses, and whether you have access to any outside space and so on. And what has really come over is the value that people living in urban environments, in that urban environment, put on having access to parks, children's centres, nurseries and other services, which was of course taken away from them during the pandemic. And that not having that opportunity to play and be together in those environments was really hard. So yeah, I think the pandemic has brought some advantages in terms of time, but also has some losses in terms of access to services and so on.
Certainly, that sounds a very familiar story to me with small children. And I'm sure to many of our participants, with the kind of variation of different experiences. Yana, were you going to answer?
Yes, I would like to share an insight from a pilot study that we did in the center as well, to collect children's experiences of learning and living during the pandemic. The working paper for which will be hopefully put online on our website next week. So one of the findings was that children have started to engage with arts much more than before the lockdown, and it was reported by the children to be one of the most pleasurable activities. And when I asked children what made it so pleasurable to them, the common response was that they had choice what activities to engage with and for how long. And even within the context of the classroom, we think that arts lends itself more to agency because presumably it provides more freedom than more structured subjects such as math, for example, or reading and writing. But even compared to the usual schooling experiences within the home during the lockdown, children found more freedom to engage in the arts on their own terms. And that's what made the activity more pleasurable to them, which of course for us means that agency enhances learning experience for children.
And Dom, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, just to follow up, thank you for reminding me, Yana. The project, of course, one of its focuses is to look at and compare science, arts, language and language/literacy for that very question. Do different subject areas make any difference, if you like, between the amount of agency, if you like, the nature of that agency and so on? So we will have something to say about that.
And that leads us quite nicely onto some of the other questions we've got here on the theme of if agency is socio-culturally situated, how does it intersect with class and family practice? And we could ask that question, I think, as well about some of the kind of comments that Alison made about slow pedagogies and the kind of time for in-depth inquiry. Are there kind of different class and social relationships between who is able to really engage in this kind of more agentic learning? I'll open that up to everyone. Go on, Peter. I shall start.
Well, this may not be spot on the point you're raising. What struck me is the relationship perhaps between agency and democracy, because it seems to me that there is a very strong tradition in what people might call progressive education, which John Dewey is a very good example, but there are many others who have seen democracy as a fundamental value and practice in education. And it seems to me that I'd be interested to explore more the relationship between a democratic education and agency. What's striking, I think, is that in our curricula, I know, democracy really doesn't figure, whereas in quite a number of national curricula, it's up there, up front, extremely central value and practice and goal of the education system. And certainly it seems to me that something needs to be given much more attention, because also I think democracy speaks not just to the individual, but also to the agency of the group. And it seems to me that, that again, there are several agents, you could say, an agency, not obviously the educator, obviously the individual child, but also the role of the group of children, the group of children and teachers in that. So I think the democracy is an absolute, well, I think it should be a fundamental value in practice. And I think it's probably one of the conditions for really giving children a strong sense of agency.
Thank you, Peter. Yana?
I would like to add to this, if I understood the question correctly, which I hope I have, familial contexts are part of the structure. So when we think about agency, there is agency versus structure. And of course, those elements that have been mentioned are part of the structure. Because of the limited scope and focus of our study, we only focus on the curriculum. So that is a single element of the structure that we choose to explore in terms of its effects on agency. But you can equally design a study to explore the effects of familial context on children's agency. And what's interesting is I teach a module on an MA module for internationally based teachers, and one of the topics to explore is agency. And I hear views saying that how are we to develop agency within the classroom in the context, in the national context where the culture is very much rule-based and children are expected to obey to the authority of to parental authority, or to invite just socially. The context is very much deontological in the sense that it's based on rules. So here's the conflict between instilling the sense of agency in children in the classroom and then going out of the classroom and having to abide by the rules, which I think responds to the question that was raised. But yes, surely it comes into play.
Dom?
Yeah, for me, I absolutely think that the point about democracy and agency is really, and given we were talking about Dewey earlier, also really important. In terms of groups, different groups in society, I find myself feeling the same worries I feel about language and the allegation that certain groups in society have, for it quotes, poorer language. It's a long-standing worry for me, that the sloppiness of the way that the language of different groups are described. So I would want to tread extraordinarily carefully around the questions around how different groups as a whole might or might not exercise agency. I think it's really important, though. Part of the design is the contrasting schools include an inner city school, a sort of outer city school, and even an independent school. And I think for me, that's a first in any research project. And the reason is the perception that in the independent sector, there is more agency for students. And that's something that we want to explore.
Thank you. And then finally, Alison, did you want to say anything about the kind of socio-cultural elements to slow pedagogies?
Well, just to add that I think at its heart it needs a sort of an attentiveness to every individual, and this kind of the importance of prolonged listening, which I think at its best can enable children from very many different backgrounds and different abilities to be able to shine. So to not preclude children, but to be open to support them.
Thank you, and thank you very much to all of our panelists. We are running out of time here, and apologies to those people we haven't managed to answer all of your questions, but thank you for providing us with some really interesting questions today, and thank you again to all our speakers for such valuable insights, and again for our collaboration with the Tomas Coram Research Unit. If you have enjoyed listening to some of this discussion about agency today, or whether we've sparked your interest, or if maybe made you think I just need to know more about this, you may be interested in our annual conference. Will is putting the links up in the chat. It's entirely focused on the idea of children's agency from early years, early childhood education to primary education. So it's going to be a day of some high profile speakers and interesting workshops as well. So do have a look at that. You may also be interested in the next seminar from Peter, along with my colleague Guy Roberts-Holmes, which is next week on neoliberalism and early childhood education. Again, I think the links are all being put in the chat, and so we would really welcome kind of further engagement at future events. Thank you again for all listening, and do get in touch with us if you're interested in our work, particularly in this area, and if you would like to know any more. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and thank you all for listening.